Got it. I've got way too many slides, so I'm going to go really quickly. And so I'm going to give you a chance to ask questions at the end of each section. But if you need me to slow down or say anything again, let me know. And with that, I'm going to get started here. Let's see, not that screen. Let's see, Zoom. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm gonna shut off my video if I can, just to preserve some of my bandwidth. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Royal River Estuary, and the time I spend on it is most of the year. So I'm going to talk about the changing seasons and the changes in my personal interaction with it, around how that works with all the fun animals and creatures and birds that live around here. I was really hoping that would click. Okay, so my brief outline is I'm going to tell you who I am, physical characteristics of the Royal River Estuary, and then I'm going to go into seasonal descriptions of what happens in the spring, the summer, and the fall and winter. So who am I? First and foremost, I consider myself a fisherman. I started as a very young age growing up on an island. I grew up on Long Island in Casco Bay, which is, as most of you know, I hope anyway, is right nearby. And when you grow up on an island like that, you have no option but to be a fisherman. So I started from a young age, slowly got bigger and got on bigger boats and luckily caught bigger lobsters. And now I still have my lobster license. I still have a commercial lobster license, but I've progressed now into, instead of commercial fishing, I'm now professional fishing. By that, I mean I'm guiding. So I take people out to help them catch fish and teach them some of the secrets about this area. And I just love teaching people. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. My company is an Address Adventures guide service. At Address, as I'm sure you fishy and river interested people know, is the word that means describes the life history of fish that live in the ocean and spawn in fresh water. And so striped bass, iron anadromous, smelt, salmon, all sorts of species. So as a scientist, it's kind of it's the perfect name for me for my business. As a business person, it's awful because people ask me, how do you spell that? I said, listen, it's Google. You can misspell it and it'll show up. But I have to show my science cred. So anyway, speaking of which, so that's Long Island right there, the X in the middle, Royal River is in the top, and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute is in the bottom left. And I will talk about that too as we go on. So in addition to being a fisherman, I'm also a scientist. I got my master's degree at the University of the Virgin Islands. I also do a lot of work at the University of Maine, as well as being a full-time scientist, a research associate at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. So my science journey started with gill netting and groundfish. This is an otolith. If you don't know anything about otoliths, I'll tell you a little bit more about them later, but they're the ear bones of fish, and they're really cool and really important. And I've spent way too much of my life paying attention to them and learning about them. In the Virgin Islands, my work was primarily on these little shrimp. This is what we call a cryptic invertebrate, which means an invertebrate that's hidden in the reef. I like fish. And so when I wasn't studying these little tiny fish, these little tiny shrimps, I was also fishing for tarpon and having all sorts of fun. I came back to Maine to work at GMRI, where I got to work on codfish. Fun fact, this photo was in the New York Times. They cut it way down though, so it just showed my hands. So I can say though that my hands would have been in the New York Times. And now I do most of my work on bluefin tuna, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but we can ask questions about it later if we want. The other role I have at GMRI is I'm also a captain, which means I'm the vessel safety officer. So I'm in charge of this boat here, as well, the Merlin, which is a former commercial tuna fishing boat. So I'm the captain for most of our science work, both on big boats and smaller boats. It's not all gory. My job is also the grinding and the painting and the sanding, all that fun stuff. So I can't get away from my island roots of doing everything on the water. So I'm not going to let you ask questions about part one because that's not interesting to people. But I'm glad to let you guys know just who I am. So part two, I'm going to talk now a little bit about the physical characteristics of the Royal River. So the Royal River is special in that it's the second largest freshwater input into Casco Bay after the Brezumscot. As most of you know who have spent time on the Royal River, Wescustigo is the Native American name for the river, and it was used up until really the middle of the 20th century. Oftentimes it's called the Wescustigo River still. I've never heard it myself, but as the name of the river itself, but people's it's still something important in the name, but it means muddy, which is a really good description of the river. It's a really low gradient river. Even without the dams, the river would still have very little flow to it, and it's quite muddy. The underlying sediment is called Brezumscot clay. So that's the geological feature that we're on. And so you guys and people who live in Yarmouth and are from here can talk a lot more about the history of the river than I can. But from an ecological perspective, it's definitely a more recovered estuary than Brezumscot. Both of them had heavy industrial usages in the past. Kind of a leg up that the Royal River has. A bragging right is that the mudflats around the Brezumscot River have been closed since 1945. You think about how few environmental regulations there were in the 1940s, how bad it must have been that they closed the mudflats to clamming. And so luckily there's a commercial fishery for clams still in the Royal River now. As we know, the Yarmouth Clam Festival isn't named by accident. So there's been a long history of human occupation and impact in this area. So basically, since the ice sheets retreated and people came here, they've been foraging and fishing in this area. If you go out on many of the islands, you'll find shell heaps, shell middens from both Native Americans for thousands of years, then later colonists that were eating these clams and just leaving the shells around. What's really, I think, one of my favorite anecdotes, I'll get to that in a second about the next one, but so in 1896, the first bridge to Cousins Island was built from Drinkwater Point. What's really interesting about the Royal is that it has two channels, one of which is the natural channel that goes to the west as it goes across the mudflats, and the whole river used to turn right and go west towards Cousins Island. In 1955, the eastern channel was dredged between the main channel and Lanes Island. And so that actually splits the flow of the river. And so I found these old charts. I don't know if any of you guys are into this stuff like I am, but historicalcharts.noaa.gov, I got lost on it for quite a while when I was doing my research for this talk. It has, I can't remember which university runs it, but they have a repository online of basically every chart historically that NOAA or the government produced, going back as far as whenever there was a government sanctioned chart. So I got lost in this for a while for all sorts of places. And then I got really circled back to look at Casco Bay. So here, can you see my cursor at all here? So you can see the river. This is the natural course of the river coming down from Yarmouth. Here in 1870, it was called the Yarmouth River. And it goes down around Parker's Point and then across, cutting off Cousins Island. And so it was all just mud flats between the river and Wayne's Island. And so the next chart was in 1942. And this shows the mud flats a little bit more detail, but still it was intact. By 1960, this channel had been dredged. And what's really interesting, if you are someone who's boated in the Royal River, whether you are the captain or not, one of the things that is very apparent about it is there's places where there's water and there's places where there's not. And so I always tell people when we're out fishing, if we're out at high tide in this general area, that you could walk to any of these islands if you wanted to, except for maybe a 50-foot wide channel, 100-foot wide channel. And so this splits the river. And so I'm not sure any specific ecological impacts that has, but it definitely has some. That there's definitely far less tidal current that goes through here because of this dredged channel by Wayne's Island. If you're in a boat in this channel, you know that it's a shelf. It's about 10 feet up and down, where as soon as you get out of the channel, depending on what kind of boat you're in, you'll immediately run aground. So what's interesting about the Royal River is these big mud flats punctuated by very, very distinct channels. And this is the most current chart there is from 2019. And again, you can see there's lots of buoyage to help you get through this very narrow channel. Anyway, as a chart geek, I found this website fascinating, and I had to incorporate as much of this as I could into my talk. But what makes estuaries so special anyway? So estuaries are, as we know, where rivers enter the ocean, but what they create is a flooded coastal wetland. So this Spartina grass you can see here is from the grass is growing and over thousands of years depositing. It dies in the fall as detritus, basically becomes mud. It makes this really interesting habitat where this is a normal high tide here on a spring tide. So that happens once a month. The whole marsh will be flooded, which brings nutrients up into the upper marsh. And then as that comes out, it also brings nutrients back down to the river for mixing. So there's two rivers that converge here, the Royal River and the Cousins River. We've got about a 9-foot tide. And one of the interesting things about estuaries is the warm water in the spring. If you go stick your foot in the Royal River right now, you will not think that it's warm, but it warms up a lot faster than the ocean does. So in a few weeks, the water that's coming out of the Royal River will be a lot warmer than the ocean water, even on the other side of Cousins Island. And so these warm hotspots, if you will, of estuaries up and down the coast are really important for migratory fish. So migratory fish that are swimming up the coast in the spring and early summer, they make these hopscotch leaps from warm estuary to warm estuary. So they'll spend a couple days out in the cold water and go north, and then cut back into an estuary and hang out and feed in warm water, kind of catch their breath again before they go north again. Likewise, the interaction of the warm and cold water fosters primary productivity and is basically just really good for life. And so obviously this is a low tide of a marsh. Yeah, just to show you guys, I'm sure you all know, but what it looks like around here when the tide is out. Salt marshes are known as some of the highest productive, highest ecologically productive systems in terms of chlorophyll adding nutrients to the ecosystem. This is a really complex food web, cartoonized to be more straightforward, but basically as things grow and die, it's all a big cycle. The nutrient cycle of detritus, so things dying, is really important in a salt marsh. They lock up a lot of carbon, for example, from when the Spartina grasses die. They make peat. One of the big problems we have are green crabs. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about them tonight, but one of the things that green crabs do is in the wintertime, they burrow into the mud because it's warmer. They don't freeze in the mud. And what happens is they erode the peat banks. And so the peat, which is the actual, the edges of the marsh here, these will start to calve off and break off almost like icebergs on a much slower scale, but it's from green crabs going up underneath. It's not just erosion, from green crabs going up underneath and eating the roots of the Spartina and making burrows up under there. So if we had to say another bad thing about green crabs, that's definitely one of them. Obviously, one of the most important things, what I'm going to talk about a lot tonight, is the animal life in these salt marshes. A huge variety of birds, invertebrates, mammals, fish that hang out here. If anyone is familiar with the website eBird, it's run by the, I think, Cornell University from their bird program. And Sandy Point, so at the head of the bridge on Cousins Island, is one of the hot spots for species diversity for birders in the area. So it's a great place to see lots of species of birds throughout the year. As I've mentioned before, of course, clam digging is very important in this area historically. I'm going to get the numbers a little off, but my neighbor is a clam digger here in Freeport. And he said that Yarmouth has half a dozen commercial harvesters and Freeport has about 55 commercial clam harvesters. So clams, although they might not, they don't have the visibility of, say, lobster boats and lobster wharves and lobster pounds. They're very important economically, especially to the people who do it. And it's very important to remember that these small, each person is their own business. And these are very important local businesses to support and to make sure that we have a healthy ecosystem for them too. One of my favorite animals to see on the mudflats are raccoons. And this is, I don't know who took this picture or where they got a picture of a raccoon in the daylight. Normally when I see raccoons is when I'm leaving the Royal River at dark 30 and it's a low tide. And so I'll be going down the river channel with a spotlight and I'll shine it on the mudflats. And as far as you can see, every once in a while, you'll see two beady little reflecting eyes looking back at you. And it's raccoons that are also enjoying the clams that are on the flats and worms and everything else. And so as someone who was a commercial fisherman, is a professional fisherman, and spends their time sciencing about fish, I care a lot about fish. So I'm going to talk a lot about fish. And so the two important things when you're trying to find fish are currents and food, both of which are very, very present in salt marshes, like the Royal River and any other marsh like that, because we've got these tidal flows, we've got the varied topography, the big primary productivity, and so these are just fantastic places to find fish. And one of my favorite quotes from, about ecosystems in general is, if you don't know what's on the menu, that means you are. So the upper marsh, so think about like by the Muddy Rudder restaurant. So the Cousins or the Royal River side of the river doesn't have as much of the marsh left as it used to. Obviously, there's some down by the Spear Preserve, but there's much more extensive marsh on the Cousins River side. And so this is where more prototypical salt marsh, where you've got the high steep banks, muddy or sandy bottom, salt pans, and salt hay. Well, the one thing I want to say about the Cousins River is, now, I guess I should have said it when I had my charts up. My favorite anecdote about this area, geologically speaking, and names, is, did you know that Cousins Island and Little John Island are named after the same guy? His name was Little John Cousins. He was an early farmer. whose farm was roughly where Granite Street ends on the across on the Muddy Rudder. And it's just a fun fact that he got 2 islands named after him. Anyway, so once you get further down the marsh, this is actually Wolf's Neck, but I didn't feel like walking down in the mud this morning to take a picture for you guys. So this is a Wolf's Neck picture I had. But as you know, this is a very similar looking scene of once you get out past Parker Point, that there's just what feel like endless mud flats around here. And while they might look devoid of life right now at low tide, at high tide, there's lots of things going on, lots of plants and animals using that area. And even at low tide, the invertebrates are living their best lives down there. All right, so that's my end of what's special about the marshes in general. I'm going to go now into the spring migrations we have around here. So you may have noticed, if you have looked out the side of your car windows, this week the elver season started. And so this is a picture of people harvesting elvers right below the 295 bridge. So there's a lot of hand dipping that goes on, hand nets. There's also fyke nets that get set up, which are nets that are set, they're passively fishing on the edges of the river. And so people are collecting elvers, which is a very lucrative fishery. It's very small in terms of the number of people and small in terms of the size of the animals they're catching, but it's worth a lot of money for aquaculture. Most of them, almost all of them, get shipped to Japan for aquaculture to be grown out into unagi, which are the adult size eels that oftentimes get shipped back here for sushi. So elvers are, you heard a couple weeks ago from an eel scientist about the life cycle of elvers, so I won't get into that too much. But just know that that's what those guys are doing. You see the lights, because the elvers come up at night. And so when you see guys from the bridge dipping, that's what they're doing. They're catching elvers. Also, if you take a look out now, you'll see birds everywhere. There's a gazillion and a half ducks moving through right now that are hopscotching from these places that have been, the ice has gone out as ducks start their northward migration, other birds. It's also smelt season very soon. So we can't dip for smelts anymore in this part of the state because the numbers are so low. But we still have smelt runs around here. And so can anyone guess where this is? I'll give you hints nearby. So this is the Mast Landing Preserve the main Audubon owns. And so smelt actually come up. So this is the Harrisecet River is beyond here. And smelt come up here to spawn. And what's really cool about smelt was they're a little bit earlier. They're between elvers. So they're after elvers and before alewives. And so they're little fish that can spawn in pretty much any creek, in any trickle, any brook that's falling into the water. And what's great about smelt is they're an important forage fish for basically everything else. They're smaller than a river herring, so it's even easier for every bird and fish and animal to eat it that wants to. And you can tell when I should have added a picture of the smelt eggs, but you can tell if smelt have been someplace because the eggs are heavier than water, and so they sink and they stick to everything. So at low tide, you can walk to some of these places and look around. If you see, it looks like white salt shaking everywhere, white or yellow, there's a smelt egg stuck on the bottom. Horseshoe crabs. We have a bunch of horseshoe crabs around here, which are really fun. I took this picture. It's not a great picture because it was, I think, midnight when I was fishing off of Sandy Point Beach on Cousins Island, and I got bumped into, and I looked down and I had a bunch of fornicating horseshoe crabs running into my feet. And so again, it's another spring species we have moving around here. Eiders are near and dear to my heart. boy, I'm talking about everything tonight. I put in more in here than I meant to. So eider creches are really cool. This one female eider did not have all of these chicks, all these ducklings. They share the responsibility of looking after ducklings. And so she was probably on an island and her chicks or ducklings hatched at the same time as another mother eider nearby, or maybe another one as well. And they all take turns. The mothers will watch after everyone's ducklings while the other mothers go and forage. Maine is special. We have a number of islands that still have offshore bird populations that have been extirpated other places. And so in Casco Bay, we have breeding eiders on some of the islands that basically used to go all the way down to Connecticut and don't anymore. And so we're special that we have these islands that still can produce good habitat for these ducklings. So it's they like places with no disturbance. So Basket Island has nesting eiders, Flag Island, a couple other islands in the bay. Short-nosed sturgeon are also some of my favorite spring migrants. You'll sometimes see them jumping. Oftentimes, if you go down to, say, Ferry Beach in Scarborough, you'll see jumping sturgeon off of the river mouth. And we're not really sure why they jump. We just know they do like to jump, and they make themselves very well known. They eat a lot of mollusks, so clams, mussels, worms, and things. So they are offshore for the winter, and then in the summer they come inshore. And so we have sturgeon in the Presumpscot River, quite a few. We see them all the time doing our work with Gina Marai. But also, I've seen two so far jump by Elaine's Island. And so we do have some of these in the Royal River Estuary that come up and hang out. They look like dinosaurs. They haven't evolved in millions of years. They're super cool fish. They're endangered. So if you catch one, you have to immediately release it before you can take a picture or anything, because preserving the life of the animal is the most important thing. So I had to use other people's pictures. I have caught a couple and I immediately let them go. So, but I can't show you that. So what kind of fisherman can't show you pictures of the fish he caught? But so that's the end of my my springtime migration pictures and anecdotes. If we want any quick questions about that, I'll be happy to take them before I go on to part 4 about the summer. Oops.
Let's see. I see a question in the chat box from Art Bell. Does the burgeoning aquaculture industry, oyster, mussels, etc., pose a threat to the ecology, the wetlands, marshland, or eelgrass?
So I think that the aquaculture is a very good thing for around here. It's excellent for water quality. We used to have many oyster beds in this area. We used to have many more mussel beds than we do now. And so those bivalves, that passive aquaculture that just eats things that are in the water, they help clean the water, and they're a very good thing to have around. We don't have an issue of primary productivity around here, as in there's plenty of plankton. Overfishing and pollution and other ecological changes that have happened have only cut down, and for the most part, have cut down the upper trophic levels. So things that eat the plankton, the thing that eats that, the thing that eats that. And so by having more of these bivalve aquaculture is not a bad thing from ecological perspective. As someone who drives a boat around here, I would like them to be marked better, and they seem to be cropping up like mushrooms these days, but that's okay, because it's again, it's small business, local business, and it's ecologically they're good to have.
Great, thanks. Question from me. Have you seen any changes in sturgeon numbers or timing or anything you can offer from here?
Well, I can only offer you anecdote. And what I can tell you is that So having grown up in Casco Bay, I never saw a sturgeon until I think probably 2015, maybe. And now we see them almost every time we go up the Presumpscot. And so in the summertime, there's tons of sturgeon around. So these are short-nosed sturgeon. There might be some Atlantic sturgeon mixed in, but from my friends at University of New England, they say that around here it's probably all short-nosed sturgeon. So if you go up on the Kennebec, you'll see tons and tons of sturgeon. But around here, there are many more than there used to be, that's for sure. And at first, we only saw them up in the river. And now on the backside of Great Diamond, between Great Diamond and Falmouth, it's very common to see them jumping now. And last summer, I think, was the first time I saw them up by the Royal. So it's really exciting that these fish that are endangered seem to be, at least anecdotally, seem to be on the rebound around here.
Great, thank
All
you.
right, I'm going to go to section 4. So this is my favorite time of year. Summer means stripers and science. I'm going to tell you a little bit about striper science and a little bit of mussel science. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the fishing that I do around here. So this is on my boat. I'm primarily a fly fishing guide. I do other types of fishing as well, but it is my favorite to just go out basically in my backyard and catch fish on the fly. As we go down the river, it's always beautiful every morning. The first bend in the river, so this is the Spear Preserve on the left here. The first bend, you're looking straight at the sunrise every morning, and it's the definition of beautiful. And I take people out in the early part of the season. We fish a lot around the Royal River. As the Royal River warms up and the estuary warms up, the fishing isn't as good, so we move further away. But in the beginning, it's always right around here. All manners of people and animals are welcome on my boat, from the oldest and most experienced to the youngest and least experienced. Plus, I love to have dogs on the boat. If somebody wants to bring their dog, they're welcome to bring their dog. The cute thing about dogs and fishing is it'd be nice if they slept all the time, but they're very interested in fish too. So they get super excited. And so just talk a little bit more about, so I guide on the weekends in the summertime, and a little bit before work. So stripers, like many fish, are what are described as crepuscular, which means they're most active at dawn and dusk. And so I can get a full day charter before I go to work or a half day charter. So I'll pick up clients at 5 a.m. and finish at 9, be to work at 10 and stay at work till 6. It makes for a busy summertime, but it's doing what I love. So, so striper feeding migrations. So much like some of the other fish we've talked about, stripers spend their falls or their winters down in the mid-Atlantic and slowly move north. Like I said, they hopscotch between estuaries for getting warm water while the ocean's still cold. It's very temperature driven, as you can see on this chart on the right. Basically, what we say is when it gets to be 50 degrees, it's worth fishing around here. So as they move up, the fishing starts off. Well, I'll get my first fish usually in the Royal River around May 20th. I won't take clients until June 1st because it feels rude to not be able to say that I know that there's fish around. So June 1st is what I consider the start of the season around here. So getting back to the ecology a little bit, part of looking for fish is not just the currents that move them around, but also the food. And so oftentimes looking for birds is what will bring fish around, because what that means is the birds are feeding. Birds usually can't find herring. This is a little juvenile herring. Juvenile herring are smart. They usually stay under the water quite a bit. However, striped bass and other predatory fish will circle up a school, push them up towards the surface, So the bass are attacking them from the bottom while the birds are attacking them from the top. And so the birds let us know that, oh, there's a school of bait over there, and there's a school of stripers over there, usually. So that's one of the telltale signs we have. You can actually tell by the type of bird, oftentimes, what type of bait is around, and you can match your fly to that. And so when you have terns like this, these are Arctic terns, oftentimes that means very small fish. So these young of the year herring, Atlantic herring. So we'll use very small flies that match that as best we can. If you have other birds like herring gulls, you can tell that there's other bigger fish around. What are the bigger fish around for bait? Usually that's river herring. And so even though we have, unfortunately, these dams still on the Royal River, that doesn't mean that the river doesn't provide something for the fish. And so although there's no spawning that happens in the Royal River anymore of alewives or blueback herring, the estuary is still super important as a feeding ground for river herring. And so this is an echogram. So it's basically a picture of the fish finder on my boat of a school of herring out in the estuary of the Royal River. So what happens is the juvenile herring, or sometimes even adults, they come into these estuaries to feed. And so even though there's not an adult population going upriver in spawning, these are still really important feeding grounds on these mudflats all around here for the river herring. And then looking at my fish finder on the right here, that's what striped bass look like. So they're much longer streaks. So usually you'll find these schools of river herring like this. They're these little small chevrons, and then the larger streaks of the striped bass that are feeding on the edges of the schools of herring. And so generally, you know that you should be fishing there. So you can see from this picture, this is by Wayne's Island, that these are herring gulls. And so that means if we know that if there's only herring gulls feeding and not terns, we know that river herring is what they're feeding on in this area. And again, anywhere from these juveniles that are 1 year old to potentially even subadults. This is probably a 3-year-old. River herring about 4 years old when they spawn. So then we use bigger flies that match these. An interesting thing about the Royal River is I've never caught an adult shad in the Royal, but I have caught juvenile shad. So I assume that they're following the same cycles as the river herring of the juveniles feeding in this area, in this warm water. If the dams were taken out, we could have shad again. Shad are super fun to fish for. This is in the Androscoggin River in Brunswick. Shad are basically just giant herring, and they're really fun to fish for. Obviously, they're important ecologically, and they used to spawn in the Royal River. So hopefully someday they will again, and I won't have to go to Brunswick to catch them. And of course, the question I get when I talk about all this stuff is, do I need a boat? No, of course not. I mean, you can, I don't want to give away all my secrets. This is my wife standing on a rock. I'll just say nearby in Freeport to the Royal River, we can catch striped bass. Oftentimes you can fish from the banks by up above the muddy rudder or down by the spear preserve. So the Royal River is easier to fish by a boat because of those giant mud flats, but it's not necessary. So now I'm going to transition a little bit to talk about one of my science projects, Snap-a-Striper. It's a program that we at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute are doing with the Coastal Conservation Association of Maine. It's a data collection program where we're trying to figure out basically where the fish we catch in Maine, where they come from. Different species or different populations of fish have different body shapes. You can think of them as basketballs versus torpedoes. Generally, fish that swim further on their migrations have a more elongated body versus the fish that stay closer to home. So we have a spawning population in the Kennebec River. And so most of the fish we get in Maine, most of the stripers we get, come up from the Chesapeake and the Delaware and the Hudson River. But we also have some homegrown fish. And so part of what we're doing is trying to figure out how many of those fish that we catch in Maine are homegrown versus migratory. So fishermen will take a picture of a fish like this for us with our data card, so you can get the scale and some associated data with it. And then we take it to the lab. We do what's called a box truss analysis, where we look at, I'm not going to count these now, I think it's 12 landmarks and 27 different measurements. Basically, it describes the shape of the fish. These basketballs and basketballs and torpedoes, generally those differences are so slight you can't see them with the naked eye, but with statistics, you can look at different shapes of fish, and it actually does work out. We're ground truthing it with otolith chemistry, which is, I mentioned otoliths earlier real quick. Otoliths are the ear bones of the fish, and they grow rings just like a tree. But really cool about fish is that not only do they grow rings like a tree, they also incorporate the water chemistry from what the fish is swimming in. So if this fish is swimming in a place with a higher, say, oxygen 18 isotope, that we reflected in its otolith. So this is the cross section of a striper otolith. You can see the rings here. So this fish is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably 6 years old. These bands, just like tree rings. But the other thing we can do, though, is we can mill out the core. So take the middle of the otolith. This is the oldest part of the fish right here in the middle. This is the original otolith that it was hatched with. And so being the oldest part of the otolith, it is the oldest part of the fish, and it represents basically the chemistry of it represents what sort of water the fish is swimming in earlier in its life. And so that's how we're trying to ground truth this project, is by using the otoliths to find out which estuary they were from, and then match up the otolith confirmed data with the shape of the fish. To date, we've done over 2,000 photos of cotton-released fish. I've got about 80 pairs of otoliths. With successful funding, we might start male scale, which is the next step of this project. So the problem we have in Maine is that we don't catch a whole lot of legal-sized fish. And by trying to harness the power of recreational fishermen, we know that we need to find another way, a non-lethal way, to get chemical data on these fish. So people aren't harvesting as many stripers in Maine anymore, so we can't get otoliths as easily. And so the next idea is to have fishermen scrape a few scales off of the fish. So again, a non-lethal sampling, just like taking a picture. And scales can also have the same sort of chemical data in them. So if you want to get involved, you're welcome to send me. This is my alter ego at GMRI, Stripers at GMRI, for this project. And I can talk a lot more about this at another time if people are interested. But just letting you guys know, that's a way you can get involved in citizen science around here. My next science project, about real quick, is a blue mussel project, where we are looking at the stable isotopes, primarily nitrogen 15. So nitrogen 15 is it's an isotope of nitrogen that is representative of basically how eutrophic an ecosystem is. So a eutrophic, I mean an ecosystem that has basically too much input of nutrients. So think sewer runoff, think fertilizer, things like that. And so what happens when you have too much nitrogen, you get algal blooms. And so that can contribute to red tide and other algal blooms that aren't toxic to us, but they cause hypoxia. So when those algal blooms die, the detritivores, so basically the animals that eat the breaking down algae, they use up all the oxygen. So there'll be dead zones, which can happen, especially in warm waters, cutoff bays, that obviously is bad for the environment and for fish and everything else. So the Friends of Casco Bay have done a lot of really cool work, where monthly they sample water all around Casco Bay to look at nitrogen levels. So we're thinking about, what could we do to help with this? And And we had the idea to use mussels. And so with blue mussels being a sessile organism, meaning they don't move around, they incorporate basically the nitrogen from what they've been eating. So over time, you can get a long-term nitrogen value for an area as opposed to just monthly or annual water samples. That's another way to collect data. And so basically it provides a long-term data set. So this is the Friends of Casco Bay data that's shown pretty good nitrogen levels on the western part of the bay, eastern part of the bay, up around Yarmouth and Freeport. It's a little elevated, as well as the really impacted parts of the watershed in the Fall River. And so we collected mussels everywhere this first summer we did it. I think it's about 100 sites. We did all these crosses where we went ashore in our little skiff and grabbed a few mussels to bring back to the lab. We weigh them, put them in a drying oven, cut out all the meat, and then grind it up and send it to a lab to get the stable isotope signatures. Importantly, we found that there's no association between mussel length, so how old the mussel is, with its nitrogen level, which is really important. So nitrogen doesn't really bioaccumulate in the mussel. So by that, I mean, if a mussel's been in a place with low concentration of nitrogen for its whole life, it doesn't just get more nitrogen. So we can have these long-term data from the life of the mussel, but it's not building over time, if that makes sense. Basically, it means we have good data. And so these are our results from the first year, where we found, different from Friends of Casco Bay a little bit, but we found a lot more nitrogen, not surprisingly, where the sewage effluent is on the east end in Portland, as well as up the Fall River. The middle of the bay looks good. The eastern Casco Bay looks good. Really high nitrogen in the Harrisecret River and Broadcoat, or was it? No, McCoy Bay. And so some of that could be from sewage. Some of that could be, there's cows. There's a lot of cows around here. You can also get non-point source solution. So a lot of these islands might have, or all these islands, all the houses have septic tanks. And so depending, well, they should, and depending on how good the septic tank is, how good the leach field is, this could be some of the nitrogen up here could be from not the best septic systems. Interestingly, the second year, so the data was, the term is kriging between the points, but basically you interpolate the data between the points. It was a little bit different for the second year we did it. So this big blotch of really high nitrogen might not be too true because there's only one point nearby, but interestingly, it's on Little Green Island, where the closest data is, where there's a big seal colony. And so seal colonies and bird colonies have been shown to elevate nitrogen levels as well. They don't use septic systems. So there's a lot of neat things you can look at with this sort of data, but it's one of the fun things we do around Casco Bay. So that's my stripers and science section. I'll take a couple quick questions on that before I quickly go into the last one, if you've got any.
Let's see.
I have
Okay.
a question.
Oh, good.
Sorry. So my question is, at times recreational activities like fishing can seem at odds with the goals of conservation. What are some ways in your mind that recreation can serve to move those conservation goals forward? You mentioned citizen science as one. Are there any other things you can think of?
So that's a great one. That's a great question. And since citizen science, coming from GMRI, that's something that we believe in a lot and have worked on for a long time, is to how to get stakeholders involved, not only from recreational fishermen, which is new to us. We've been working with commercial fishermen for a very long time, basically to show that not all science is out to get them, and that when we go on boats with commercial fishermen, it adds some veracity to us and to them, which means that they know that we actually care what they're seeing and what they are doing. They can see us do science, and that helps a lot to help them realize that not all science is out to get them. It helps a lot of helps us when we talk to managers, that it gives some credence to the fishermen, what they're saying, that we were there too. But that that's a real challenge, though, despite all our best efforts. Like I mentioned, we don't have many otoliths from that striper project. And a big part of that is because a lot of times the guys that are really interested in the fishermen and fisherwomen that are very interested in science and want to help also are the ones that are catch and release fishing. And so if you're catch and release fishing, that's great, but it also means that we can't get those otoliths. And oftentimes the people that are killing as many fish as they can, they don't want to talk to the scientist. And this is a very real problem that we've been working on. And it's not just us, it's all science institutions and society in general. And so by massaging our methods to try to meet people in the middle is what we've done. And so by trying to do scales, so trying to find a non-lethal way to get similar data is one way that we've been doing it. But yeah, I mean, that's something we think about all the time, is how to get people involved. And I guess really what it comes down to is more education too. I think that we at GMRI try really hard to teach people what we're doing and why we're doing it and get kids involved. It's part of why I'm here tonight too. put the face on a scientist, even though I've got my camera off.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think just the more people that are out on the water fishing, the more people will appreciate conservation goals too.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Zach. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You were talking about otoliths and trying to identify the sort of the life story of the striper. I wondered, are there any genetic markers that you know of that can tell you about different striper populations? I know that some people have been successful about getting DNA from scales. So I'm just curious what you might know about it.
Yep. I'm glad you asked. That was one of my caveats I did not bring up, and I'm glad that you did. So Maine, the Kennebec River, well, actually, basically every major and medium-sized river on the East Coast used to have a spawning striper population. In Maine, even, we probably had 10 different populations until colonists came and commercial fishing started rather than subsistence fishing. And there are these awful accounts you can read from as late as the 1890s of the Kennebec River, where people would do a stop seine, which is a net you set across a cove and then wait for low tide and then collect all the fish that got stuck in it. And so you can read the records of, 1890, we caught 15,000 pounds of spawning striped bass in whatever cove. 1891, we caught 4,000 pounds of spawning striped bass in whatever cove. The next year, they caught 2,000 pounds, and then we never saw any again. And so there was a ton of fishing pressure on spawning fish. And so all those, basically every river population of striped bass on the East Coast of the US anyway, was extirpated by the 1890s or early 1900s. down as far south as Hudson River. So the Kennebec River fish were brought back in the 1980s through the work of the Maine Department of Marine Resources by taking fish from the Hudson River that were about to spawn, brought them, or no, they took young of the year. So they were just spawned fish, a couple 100,000 over 2 years, just spawned fish, brought them to the Kennebec River to release them, basically to imprint like a salmon or a goose, to that was their home base. And so that's actually a restarted fishery or restarted spawning population. So long story short, it means that their genetics are the same as Hudson River fish. And that's a problem we've had with many species of fish. River herring throughout the state of Maine, alewives have been moved by the hundreds of thousands every year since the late 1800s to all different rivers. So when we've tried to do stock structure work on alewives, genetics are almost useless because everything is all mixed together. So that's why with striped bass, we're using other what we call natural tags. So using this chemistry or a phenotypic life trait, which is the body shape that is a little bit affected by genetics, but is more affected just by the individual life history of the fish.
Thanks. I really appreciate that answer. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right. I'm going to move on to the next and final section. So after my very busy summer of sciencing and fishing around here a lot, is then what I consider my vacation time of the year, which is when I go out on the water around here, mostly for me. So that's when the waterfowl migration is coming through and it's waterfowling season. So around here, we know mallard ducks we always see in parks and walking on the Hannaford parking lot. A little more elusive are black ducks, like this on the right. Black ducks are have been for millennia the main waterfowl in this area. Interestingly, we had no breeding pairs of mallards in Maine until the early 1900s, or most of the East Coast didn't have mallard ducks that were brought by hunting clubs and eventually became wild and to be now outnumber a lot of native species, including black ducks. And actually mallard ducks and black ducks can hybridize, and more than 50% of the black ducks on the East Coast now are hybridized with mallard ducks. And so not only do they outcompete black ducks, they also water down the genetics, which is sad, but the black duck is really the iconic waterfowl in this area. I'd be remiss to not talk about buffleheads. Buffleheads are, you'll see them, especially they show up usually early November. You'll see them from the Cousins Island Bridge, gazillions and gazillions of them. They're very small. They're the smallest duck in North America. And the drakes, the males, have these very prominent white heads. And these are the hens, the females. And there's millions of them, not millions, but there's thousands of them around in the fall on the Royal River and in this area. We also get an influx of sea ducks. So these eiders that you see on the left, this is a drake and a hen eider. Eiders are year-round residents for us, but many more show up in the winter, which I'll talk about again in a little bit. We also get we have 3 species of scoters that show up. This is a surf scoter on the top, and the bottom right, this is a long-tailed duck. Again, these ducks make huge rafts at the mouth of the Royal River and at the mouth of Brezumscot, and they're just feeding these estuaries. All these ducks eat lots of mollusks, worms, they eat little fish if they can get them. What's really cool is eiders we see all the time at GMRI because they use our float to eat green crabs. So a green crab has legs going all over the place, it makes them difficult to eat. So the eiders have figured out that if they dive around the float at GMRI, they can then hop up on the raft and they hold the duck, they hold the crab by one leg at a time and shake their head vigorously until the leg pops off. And they do that again and again, and then they can eat the body of the crab, and then their gizzard breaks it down because they don't have teeth. And so I'll go down to the GMRI dock in the morning and it'll be covered in green crab legs. So, well, thank you for helping take care of invasive species. So the Royal River is also an important place in waterfowling history. So Lane's Island, which is just off of Winslow Park in Freeport, was owned by the L.O. Bean family. And L.O. Bean himself had a duck hunting cabin on the island on the east end of it. And one of his best friends and hunting buddies was George Soule. And George Soule in the decoy world is a very, very famous decoy carver. And he was having far more success than his buddy L.O. Bean for years. So L.O. Bean finally said, listen, George, you've got the best decoys around. You're making the rest of us look silly. You need to come to my store and make these for me, and we can go into business together. And so these are very classic George Soule style cork decoys with a wooden head that L.O. Bean sold for many, many years. And they still make reproduction ones now, even though George and LL both passed away years ago. But you can see, the resemblance is uncanny here. So why are the ducks really here for eiders? It's this. This is from, this is Eider Food 101. Up to, I think it's 80% of their diet can be blue mussels. They absolutely love mussels. And so this is, I took my dog for a walk the other day. I shouldn't tell you this because there's not supposed to be dogs there, but we walked down to Sandy Point at low tide so I get some pictures. And so this is the mussel bed on Sandy Point. And so it's as far as you can see, just these huge mussel beds. However, one of the most important things about eiders to me is I love them and I love watching them, of interacting with them. And I also like to hunt them. I like to eat them, and it's also a big part of the heritage around here. And so this is my dog Zoodle. We're out on the end of Cousins Island here. We've got decoys set up, and sometimes we're successful. Oftentimes we get beautiful sunrises, and the duck hunting around here is highly regulated, and the regulations change every couple of years as surveys are taken to assess the populations of the ducks and hunting pressure. It's a well-managed and renewable resource. Of course, you get this cute little dog and she goes swimming in cold weather, and she works really hard, and it is her favorite time of the year by far. What do I do with ducks? So on the left, that's what I do with black ducks. That is duck confit. It is basically you make duck ham out of the legs. It's absolutely incredible. The breasts are very similar to venison, except with a nice fat cap on them. On the right is eider sausage. So eider, as something that eats basically only mussels, are flavorful, I think is the most polite way to describe eiders. More flavorful than most people like. And so I make sausage out of them. And then what I do is, one of my favorite meals is my famous mussels 2 ways, which is I cook mussels with eider sausage as well. And so it's kind of a fun play of eating them both together, and really appreciating where we are, and being not only being in the ecosystem, but being part of the ecosystem. It's a big part of why people came here from not only from native cultures that came here was for food, but also European cultures coming here for food and to have the ability to hunt and eat wild food. So this is overwintering ducks. And so this is looking from the bridge at Sandy Point. Eiders make these huge rafts where there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ducks that hang out together. They basically follow the ice down. They stay just in front of the sea ice. And Maine ends up being, because the Bay of Fundy gets a lot more ice than we do here, Maine ends up being a very important overwinter feeding area for ducks. Like I showed all the mussel beds around here. So it's very, very important for overwintering ducks. And like I said, if you take a boat through this area in December, January, you'll be shocked at the thousands and thousands and thousands of ducks you'll see of all different species. It's really an impressive sight that most people don't get because most people are smart enough to not be on their boats that time of year. And what ends our season generally is ice. So this is ice in the Royal River. You can see here on my depth sounder that it's the water is 29 degrees because it's all freezing. And once the ice comes, it's usually before the end of the season. And so it gives us and the ducks time to rest for the winter. And they don't care about the ice. They just need open water enough to feed and to be safe, to get away from predators. And so it's kind of a misconception that all ducks migrate or that all waterfowl migrate. Geese will stay here year round. They nest here. Black ducks spend all year here. Mallards do too. And so there's actually quite a bit of bird life. Even when things look frozen at the mouth of the Royal up around Cousins Island, there's still a ton of birds around. Because basically they're conserving their energy and they're not going to fly any further south than they need to when everything they need is right here. So that concludes my marathon deck of slides. And I'll be happy to take any questions or comments. Like I said, I generally wear two hats from GMRI and my own business. There's many ways to contact me beyond tonight. So yeah, let me know what other questions or comments you might have.
Great. Thank you, Zach, so much. This has been really fascinating. Certainly for me to get a chance to look at places that I know through your eyes, and really interesting. So a couple questions in the chat. Debbie, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Blue mussels and the population of blue mussels is definitely on the decline, north and south. And so what I was wondering is there a consensus for why this is happening, or are scientists still struggling to figure it out?
I think yes to both. So we've been really interested in this question at GMRI. So in addition to invasive species, which are really detrimental to mussels, whether it's blue or green crabs, Asian shore crabs, milky ribbon worms, anything like that is very bad for mussels. But there's still kind of the tricky thing that we found is that there's still really good seed sets. And so mussels are episodic spawners. There can be a good year when everywhere substrate will be covered in these millimeter long mussels and they get eaten. And so I think that there's a number of invasive species that are issues. I think that the commercial harvest has really gone down. That being said, the mussel aquaculture is probably a very good thing for the species as a whole, because with the mussels up on rafts, they don't get attacked by green crabs. They still get attacked by ducks, by eider ducks. All the rafts have bird nets underneath them in the water to keep ducks away. And so I think that there are oases of help, basically, because all those mussels on the raft still spawn and they still contribute to those giant seed sets we see around. Why the decline so precipitously is kind of tough when there's been variation in green crabs and everything for the years. So it's something that we've looked at a lot and will continue to, but it's one of the sad things around here. What's interesting, we did transects a couple years ago. Basically, we wanted to see what we found of this project is that mussels are everywhere, but very hard to find, or very hard to find randomly, if that makes sense. If you throw a quadrat in the intertidal now compared to 20 years ago, it's much less likely to have landed on a mussel. But if you spend 5 minutes looking, you can find them because they're in crevices, they're under rocks, they're much more hidden, I think, than they used to be. And so we really don't have the mussel beds around here that we used to have compared to down east. I went down east this spring for some mussel work, and there were, huge mussel beds. So seeing what I did on Cousins Island the other day, actually at Sandy Point, was definitely a good sign. Well, I mean, that was the most live blue mussels I've seen in a long time around here. So
that's good to know. I worried about all these diving ducks that are relying on mussels for nutrition, and I'm sure that over at the Cousins Sandy Point, I didn't realize there were so many mussels over there. I had no idea. So I was glad to see that photo.
yeah, and that's definitely a concern for the duck managers as well, that we don't, like, what I think of in my lifetime as gazillions of ducks, I guess isn't anything compared to what it was 30 years ago around here. And other places, like Cape Cod especially, has had a huge drop in their eider numbers over winter because their mussel beds have declined. So
I believe that our local representative from Cousins Island has a question.
You just woke him up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. I have a public service announcement and and what was the last thing? I don't know. I have three things. So the first question is, I remember hearing this winter when the ice finally froze on Kezar Lake in Lovell. There was still a hole in the middle of the lake, and there was some loons out there, and they the bird rescue guys were called, and they went out there and they were able to, skinny out there and with a little raft or something, and they got those loons, and they took them to they put them under the Cousins Island Bridge, because that's where loons hang out in the winter. That's their migration pattern, is from Lovell to Yarmouth. It seems like a pretty modest migration thing, but that was kind of cool that they did that. I didn't realize that. But then my public service announcement is that tonight at 9:00, I put it on the thing, the chat. There's a thing on the Klamath River Dam. The American Rivers has got a special webinar or something on the Klamath River dam removal. So I'm putting that out for some of the people on this thing. And then the last thing is, a news alert. This afternoon up in Augusta, we passed the House chamber passed the water reclassification bill, and it was unanimous that it was all green. The whole thing was green. Not one person said push the red button. And it was like, I've never seen that before. And so that was really a cool moment. And everybody, it was pretty really cool. So that's all I have.
Good news, Art.
I have a question. We know that dredging of harbors is a necessity and reality for navigational purposes. Have you, in the time that you've been out on the water, do you tend to see changes in terms of wildlife as dredging is happening or has happened, or?
So I haven't been around much dredging. So I don't know. Yeah, I didn't fish up here before and after and around the most recent dredging in Yarmouth. What was really interesting, there's a lot of mitigation efforts goes is. So last time they dredged Portland Harbor, a number of lobstermen were contracted to fish ventless traps with very small mesh, much smaller than normal, to catch as many juvenile lobsters and crabs as possible, and move them out of the harbor before the dredging happened. And so there's definitely, I can't answer your question with any certainty, but there's definitely environmental considerations that are taken into account when those projects are happening. So,
Oh yeah, there's a lot of discussion. There's
a lot of movement, and so there's a lot of practical things you can do to mitigate changes.
Yeah.
What's interesting, if you look at the, I was really hoping when I looked at those old charts, I was hoping to see depth differences. I just think it hasn't been surveyed. I think that most of the Royal River and the channel, especially the non-dredge channel, the one that goes under the bridge, I think that hasn't been surveyed since 1870. Because if you look at the different charts, they all have the same numbers in the same places since 1870. And so I was thinking that when they cut the eastern channel by Lane's Island, which is now the preferred channel, I figured that having split the tidal stream, that would result in basically shoaling of the Cousins Island channel because there wasn't enough flow going through it anymore. And I think it hasn't been surveyed since to prove that. So I was hoping because obviously that would have ecological differences or resulting from that. So that's one of the things I was really excited to look at, those old charts, and realized no, that I just haven't surveyed it. So it could be shallower, but that one, because the dam is so close to the dams, we don't get a huge freshet from the Royal. I think that the mud flats are pretty stable around there compared to Portland. The Presumpscot in Portland, those mud flats change all the time, which is a huge pain because I do a lot of work up there with GMRI. And basically every summer, beginning of the summer, I go up the river at low tide in one of our boats to mark the channel because it's always moved, 50 yards east or north or whatever since the previous fall. But the first dam there is quite a bit of ways away. So.
Great. Well, I think we would have time for one other question. Certainly, if anybody wants to. I'm impressed by the early mornings and amazing amounts of time you spent out of the water. It's been really interesting to see. And oh yeah, Bruce, did you want to ask one?
Oh, well, I was going to ask the question that you collect all this nitrogen data information. What do you do with it? Are you trying to do point source remediation, or are you targeting
So we do a lot of
improvements
that.
in some way, shape, or form, or what?
We do a lot of collaboration with Friends of Casco Bay, and so they do a lot more. They do a lot more of the on the ground, excuse the pun, work and community work to work on non-point source non and point source solution or pollution than we do. But we share all of our data with them. We also publish our findings. And so most of what we're doing for us is just monitoring for us, and then hopefully it's actionable for other groups.
But another question I had was, you didn't really mention alewives as fish that are in and around the Royal Estuary, and do you find alewives in and
Yes.
around? Do they just come up into the Spartina as well, or but since they can't get further upriver, or?
Yeah, so I oftentimes use the collective term river herring to talk about both alewives and bluebacks. And we definitely have both that come up into the Royal River Estuary. And so oftentimes in June, there'll be juveniles that are 1 or 2 year old fish up around the mooring field that feed. And so it's definitely, and all through the channel and all through those mud flats, sometimes there's huge schools of them. And so, yes, it's definitely, the Royal River Estuary is an important feeding area for juvenile alewives. There's some adults, but again, there probably would be a lot more if they could go, if they could go up the river. If there was actually a production area, not just a feeding area. I think that the Royal River is better suited for blueback herring anyway, though, just because bluebacks prefer flowing water and alewives still water. That being said, there are some places where alewives can spawn in slightly moving water. And I think that without the dams, the Royal River still wouldn't have much flow to it at all. So it could potentially sustain alewives, even if the historical spawning areas like Sabbath Day Lake aren't available anymore. So they are around for sure.
Great. Well, I always love hearing about the sturgeon. So that's a personal favorite of mine. So.
Oh, good.
Great. Well, this has really been wonderful. I've absolutely appreciated your time and energy, and it's as not naturally a salty person, it's lovely to be reminded of the estuaries and the ocean connection. So it's been really lovely, and sort of jealous of all the people that go out with you. So we really appreciate your time with us. It's been lovely.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. This is great.
Thanks so much, Zach.
Thank you.